Their Science 9. So today what we're going to cover is actually two lessons or two topics at once. One is the nitrogen cycle and the other is the phosphorus cycle. For you guys, I'll be looking for you for your notes to copy down a diagram showing these different cycles, showing the nitrogen cycle, showing the phosphorus cycle. Coming to a test situation, this is the kind of thing I might look for you to be able to draw for me as part of your answer in a test question. Also, you've seen that there's a project I'm having you do on the topic of cycles, topic of matter cycles. That's something that you should also keep in mind here. Some of you I see have already completed that project, which is great. But others of you, maybe you want to learn a little bit about these cycles before you move on to that. Also, as part of today's lesson, because it's going to be a bit longer, because I'm also throwing in an experiment that I'm conducting. And you know what? If the experiment doesn't work, we're just not going to have you do the write-up. But if it does work, then that's great. And I'm really excited about the possibility of that. So you'll see that a little bit later on in today's lesson. So first of all, what is a cycle? Well, you've already seen with the carbon and the water cycle that in any kind of cycle, you're starting with some kind of a substance and you change it in some way. You move it from one part of the biosphere into another. Or maybe it goes from the atmosphere into the geosphere. Maybe it starts as part of a living thing and then is no longer part of a living thing. It can then change forms from one form to another. But a key thing about any cycle is that you can go back to where you started. This is what's true of carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, really any element, any substance that can go through cycles, can change forms and come back to how it used to be. What are nitrogen? What are phosphorus? Why are they important? Well, just to review for you, nitrogen and phosphorus. Here's nitrogen. All right. And here's phosphorus. This dynamic periodic table is awesome, by the way. They're chemical elements. Now, we don't eat pure nitrogen, and we don't eat pure phosphorus. Pure nitrogen, we breathe in, nitrogen gas, and it's completely non-reactive. Because it's so non-reactive, our bodies are completely unable to do anything with the nitrogen in the air. It has to be changed chemically. It has to enter the nitrogen cycle from the atmosphere for us to use it at all. But nitrogen is also extremely important. Nitrogen is an element that you find in proteins, right? Sugars and fats, they don't have nitrogen in them, but you know that part of your body, like your muscles and so forth, or really in all of your cells, it's always got proteins as well. It's part of how your cells work. We need nitrogen because proteins need nitrogen. Different proteins have different nitrogen compounds in them. Also, phosphorus is extremely important. Similarly, we don't consume phosphorus. It's extremely flammable and dangerous in every way. But phosphorus is a really important element because it's part of a molecule that's found in every one of your cells. That molecule is called DNA. DNA has a lot of phosphorus in it. And there's other compounds inside your cells that have phosphorus. It turns out that even though there's not a whole lot of it in your body, phosphorus is actually extremely important for all organisms to survive. Not only is it in your DNA, but it is in other parts of your cells, and it's extremely important for how the cells work. So we need nitrogen for our proteins. We need phosphorus for our DNA and other things that happen inside our cells. And we don't need much of them. And so when they cycle through the environment, a little bit can go a long way, and we're going to look at that. But the first thing I want to do is to show you guys these different cycles as just diagrams that are often given. And I also would like to get in a little bit into how the cycles are being affected by human activity. All right, let's start with the nitrogen cycle. And where's the one I wanted? It is here. Good. All right, so this is one way of thinking of the nitrogen cycle. In this diagram of the nitrogen cycle, we are looking at actual total amounts of nitrogen. the total amount of nitrogen, those numbers are in teragrams. So you know how on your computer you can have a megabyte of storage, and that's really not very much. That's like a little picture you might send as an attachment. Or a gigabyte of storage, maybe that's a short movie or something like that, like a video. A terabyte, that's a trillion, right? That's like 1,000 short videos of memory. It's a really big number. Anytime you put tera in front of something, that means a trillion. These numbers here are in teragrams. That means trillions of grams. There's a couple words you see right here, Haber-Bosch. What that is a way of making compounds that have nitrogen in them from the atmosphere. Remember how I said that the nitrogen in the atmosphere is so non-reactive? It's non-reactive because it has these really strong triple bonds between the nitrogen atoms. So it's really hard to rip apart those nitrogen atoms. So it's really hard for living things to get at the nitrogen that they need to survive. But with this is a human process. Humans invented this, the Haber-Bosch process. It's a way of taking this non-living nitrogen that is in the air and turning it into fertilizers. You might remember a while ago I showed you a diagram that talked about how we were really pushing some of our nutrient cycles globally. We were reaching certain, I think that it was tipping points. What was the expression that I used? We'll try and find it later. One thing you might remember about that is that for the nitrogen cycle, we as humans globally, in terms of what the biosphere can deal with, we're pushing the limits by how much fertilizer we're using. We need all this fertilizer to eat. We would not have to be able to have as many people on Earth as we do if we didn't have this little process here called the Haber-Bosch process used for making fertilizer. Without it, we would be able to make far less in the way of crops, and billions of people would likely starve. But it's not perfect because it has other negative effects in the environment, which I want to get into in a little bit. So let's look at these values here. With the Haber-Bosch process, 120 teragrams of fertilizer are made every year. That's 120 trillion grams, or 120 billion kilograms, or 120 million tons. They're all the same thing. I'm just trying to tell you it's a huge amount. A teragram is really big. Let's see what else is going on here. We've got this here is gases that are going into the atmosphere. Ammonia gas, nitrogen monoxide, nitrogen gas. They're coming out of the ground here. Uh-oh, look at this. Here we've got a factory that's burning, and it's burning materials that have nitrogen in them, and it's making compounds that have nitrogen and oxygen. These are actually very harmful to human health, and they're going into the atmosphere right here, 40 teragrams per year. But it's a cycle. Here's deposition. In the case of deposition, what's happening is compounds that have nitrogen in them are coming out of the atmosphere. Now that nitrogen gas, the two nitrogens with a triple bond between them, that's not going to come out of the atmosphere. That stays there. But other compounds like these NOx compounds or ammonia, other compounds that are gases that are in the atmosphere that have nitrogen, they can go back to the ground. That's deposition. Some of them go into the ground, like into the soil. Some of it, as you can see right here, goes into the ocean. Also, this is a very important thing, stage of the nitrogen cycle right here. This thing you see here called fixation. What's happening here is this is a wild plant, and it has roots. Inside the roots, next to the roots, are bacteria. The bacteria are able to take those nitrogen molecules, the N2 molecules, the nitrogens with the triple bonds, and tear those bonds apart and make nitrogen that the organisms can use. Because remember, the nitrogen gas in the atmosphere, you can't use it directly. We need to get a nitrogen from other things. Bacteria are really smart about this. They are actually able to rip apart those nitrogen molecules and make nitrogen into a chemical form that can be used by living things. That's called fixation. It happens in the soil, it happens in plant roots, and oh, look here. It also happens in crops that people plant, right? This is what's going on naturally here, and this is what's going on in our agricultural systems. In fact, look, there's more nitrogen fixation happening in our food crops than there is in nature. That's very telling, isn't it, with how much of an effect human beings are having on our environment. Where does all this, what does the fixation? Well, it's bacteria that do the fixation, which is a proof that the tiny things that we can't see are often extremely important for our survival. But more specifically, the fixation is happening with certain kinds of plants and not with others. Bean plants are very important for nitrogen fixation. So you might, soy tofu, right? You get tofu from soybeans. Soybeans are planted over massive areas of the world. Soybeans are nitrogen fixers. But the alder trees you see in the forest around here, they're nitrogen fixers as well. Wherever plants have figured out how to do this, to get the bacteria to do it for them, the plants always do really well because that's the plant's way of making their own fertilizers. That's fixation. Now, nitrogen compounds like nitrates are really soluble. That means that they dissolve into water really easily. So you can get your fertilizers going into the ground for crops. You can get fixation, bringing nitrogen into the soil. Some of that nitrogen ends up in a non-living form, like nitrates. Those nitrates are really soluble. When they get into water, the water carries them away. This 80 right here, means 80 teragrams of nitrogen per year are going into the ocean. So how is that going to affect your immune systems? That's an interesting question. I'm going to get to that in a little bit. What happens inside the oceans? I'm going to talk about aquatic environments in a little bit more detail in a moment, but let's have a look right here. In the oceans, we've got this process here called denitrification. I'm not really sure how much I want to talk about this, but I will tell you this much. There's two things that happen that bacteria, there's two other things that bacteria do. So I've already told you about fixation, but there's also nitrification and denitrification. The names actually make a lot of sense once you kind of, hear it out. Nitrification is where you're taking the nitrogen that is not yet available to plants and you're making it available to plants. The denitrification is where bacteria take the nitrogen that used to be available to plants and make it unavailable to plants. So, to be more specific, I think I'm going to show you the next diagram. This is a more kind of a close-up view of the nitrogen cycle with more of an emphasis on nature. Let's have a look at what we've got. First of all, we've got our plants. Plants, if you've ever used fertilizer, if you've ever had a garden or help with gardening and used fertilizer, the nitrogen you're using for fertilizer is mostly going to be in the form of what's called a nitrate. You might remember from the chemistry unit that a nitrate is a nitrogen atom with 3 oxygen atoms joined to it. It's a polyatomic ion. Plants love it. They can soak it up through their roots and make more nice green plant parts because they need it to make proteins. Now, here what we've got is a plant that's figured out how to do that nitrogen fixing thing. So your nitrogen from the atmosphere is able to permeate into the soil, and these bacteria that live in these little root nodules like soybeans are able to take that nitrogen and make it into nitrogen they can use. There's also the same bacteria in the soil. So yeah, they live in the root nodules, but they also just live in the soil. Let's see what goes on with them. Well, one thing is that when the plant parts die, what part of this whole process is making what's called the ammonium ion. So, and also when plant parts die, we get this stuff called ammonium. Ammonium cannot directly be used by the plants. There has to be another process, and that's the nitrification. So what we've got going on with nitrification, we start out with this polyatomic ion, ammonium, and it becomes this polyatomic ion, nitrite, and then becomes nitrate. So when you're going from ammonium to nitrite to nitrate, this is really important because this is the only way you're going to get nitrogen that the plants can use again. They need the nitrates for their roots to be taken up by the roots to make more plant parts. And also, let's look in the middle here. This is a really important part of the whole process, is decomposition. So we see fungi and bacteria. When plant parts die, like when a plant falls to the ground or there's leaves dying, the decomposers start to act on it. Fungi and bacteria start to take the proteins that used to be part of the plant, and they break those proteins up. And this is part of how the ammonium ion comes into existence, right? So we start with the protein from plants. The decomposers act on it, fungi and bacteria, and you get ammonium. This ammonium then is being produced by the nitrogen-fixing bacteria and also by the decomposers breaking up plant parts. And then this whole nitrification process, it makes the nitrates that the plants can use again. And let's look at this. Is this a cycle? Yes. Is it more complicated than just a single circle? Definitely more complicated. Let's follow the path of a nitrogen atom. So this one here, nitrogen atom, we can imagine from the air, ends up getting fixed by a soil bacterium, becomes ammonium. Another kind of bacterium makes nitrite, and then another kind of bacteria makes nitrate, and then it gets taken up by the plant. Or it starts up as we start in the atmosphere again. It enters a root nodule of a plant, and that's all in-house. Now the plant has been able to use it to grow. Now this plant, however, can die. Let's follow the case for a plant dying. So we imagine this same plant right here. It's being fixed, and you know what? Let's be simple about it. We've gone through here, and we're going through nitrogen-fixing bacteria again from the atmosphere to here. We get ammonium, nitrite, nitrate. Plant takes it up, but this time the plant dies, gets decomposed. Ammonium, nitrite, nitrate. See that cycle right there can all of a sudden now not involve the atmosphere. Or we can do this. The plant can be eaten by an animal, and the animal can then die, or it can excrete ammonium through its urine, and now the animal is part of the nitrogen cycle. It doesn't have to be part of the nitrogen cycle. The nitrogen cycle will still run if you kill all the rabbits, but the rabbit can be part of the cycle, just like you can be part of the nitrogen cycle whenever you eat anything that has nitrogen. Oh, and here's something else that kind of throws an added complication is lightning. Lightning can be part of the atmospheric nitrogen cycle. So what can happen is if you get a lightning strike, the lightning strike can break those powerful triple bonds between nitrogen atoms. And then if you have low nitrogen atoms, if they don't rebond with a nitrogen atom again, they can bond with oxygen and make compounds, nitrogen oxides, that then can be used by plants. That's another way nitrogen becomes part of the cycle. So it's not just a single circle, this cycle. You can follow any number of different pathways through this cycle, and they are all routes that nitrogen can follow through the environment. The nitrogen cycle is a little more complicated than, say, the water cycle, for example, even though the water cycle it's not like it's a simple cycle either. What I'd like you to be familiar with is the fact that nitrogen is found in the air, in the ground, in the water, and also in living things. I'd like you to be familiar with the importance of decomposers, and especially I'd like you to be familiar with the importance of bacteria. Bacteria that take the nitrogen from the air and make it into nitrogen forms that can be used by plants and animals, and also the bacteria that they're almost like the meanies, these denitrifiers, because what these guys can do is they take those nitrates, and instead of them going to the plants, they end up back in the air. The nitrates actually go back to being nitrogen. So there's a lot going on with the nitrogen cycle. And, if we get to a test situation, I'm telling you, what to worry about for a test on the nitrogen cycle, well, I'll tell you. Now, let's also look here. What about water? We're doing an experiment on the topic of nitrogen in water. So I figured let's talk about that a little bit. And I think all I really want you to see is this, that the same kind of processes that happen in the soil also happen in the water. Here we're imagining a fish, and the fish, through excretion, it excretes ammonium ions. It's not really shown correctly right there. That should be NH4. That should be either NH3 or NH4 plus, but whatever. Ammonium. By nitrification, again, we can go from ammonium to nitrite to nitrate. That nitrate can be used by aquatic plants, which has other effects on the environment. The fish can eat the aquatic plants. Other kinds of organisms can eat the aquatic plants, or the aquatic plants can die and decompose. I'm going to get to that in a little bit when I talk a bit more about other nutrients. Specifically, I want to talk to you a bit about the phosphorus cycle. I've only got one diagram I'm going to show you about the phosphorus cycle because this diagram kind of captures everything. The first thing that you need to know about the phosphorus cycle in comparison with, say, the water cycle or with the carbon cycle or the nitrogen cycle, the way it's different is that the phosphorus cycle does not involve the atmosphere. Phosphorus doesn't form compounds that will, excuse me. Phosphorus does not form compounds that exist in the atmosphere. The conditions on Earth just don't allow it. So wherever the phosphorus is found, it's going to be found in one of two places. Either it will be in the water or it will be on land. It will not be in the air. Now, when it's in the water, of course, it could be in a stream, it could be in a lake, or it could be in the ocean. When it's on the land, it can be in the soil, it can be in the rocks, or it can be in living things. Let's look at this diagram right here. I think, again, you can probably also see that when we call it a cycle, is it a cycle? Yes. But is it a single circle, a loop? No. Again, we see the phosphorus cycle is a little more complicated than that. But let's look at the major players. First of all, there is phosphorus in the rock. Also, phosphorus exists in living things. I'm trying to find, here's a dead thing. And phosphorus exists. Phosphorus compounds are created by us. All right, let's be more specific right here. So, phosphates are found in rock, not just any old rock. There's certain types of minerals, rocks and minerals that have phosphorus in them. And you can bet that people know where they are. Where phosphorus is known to be in the rock is often being mined in the past. I'm going to see if I can find it just a sec. Yeah, okay. I'll bet you never heard of this. The Chincha Islands War. The Chincha Islands War was fought between Peru and Chile in the 19th century. The deal is this. They were fighting over phosphorus and over nitrogen. The thing is that it used to be that people didn't know about the Haber-Bosch process, and they didn't know about other places where they could find phosphorus in the ground. At least no places that were quite so good as these islands off the coast of Peru and Chile. The water there is very cold. As a result, because of the ocean currents, you get a huge amount of plant growth inside the ocean, and that supports a lot of fish, supports a lot of animals, supports a lot of birds. The bird poo on these islands, because the islands are so dry, would just dry out instead of get washed into the ocean. So on these islands, these Chincha Islands, they would have deposits of guano that were several meters thick. And so these islands were very important politically as mining sites. And eventually it got to a place where Peru and Chile could not agree on who owned these islands, and they fought a war over it. So this is one type of an example of a place where phosphorus has been found and mined in the past. Let's go back to the phosphorus cycle. As we see, it comes from mines. Some of it that is mined ends up in river runoff. Phosphorus, again, is quite soluble. Not quite as soluble as nitrates, but it is soluble. Some of that phosphorus extraction does end up in fertilizer. Again, this comes from mines, like the guano mines off the coast of South America. Plants are very thirsty for phosphorus. When there's phosphate in the soil, the plants will send their roots to pick it up and to grow into new plant parts. What else can happen to phosphorus? Well, one thing that can happen to phosphorus is it can end up in living things which then die, and those things that die can end up in the soil and can also end up in the water. The phosphorus for them can end up in the water. I'm gonna have to sign off for now, and I'm gonna start this up again in a little bit. Hey there. So just finishing up what I was saying about the phosphorus cycle, and it'll lead in a little bit to the experiment. So just like nitrogen, phosphorus is taken up by living things. Plants can take it up through their roots, and having been taken up through the roots, it can then enter food chains because, of course, organisms that eat plants, including us, we then get our phosphorus from the plants we eat. Plants are able to take in, however, non-living forms of phosphorus as phosphates. So plants take in phosphorus as phosphates, and then they make plant parts, and we eat the plant parts, and the plant parts have some phosphorus. It's the same in the water, except the thing with the water is the plants in the water are different. The plants in the water are very small types of plants called algae. I had a picture I was going to show. Algae you would think of them more, I think, as just green slime would be one way of describing it. Here we see an example of some algae. Let's look at this picture right here. That's the one I wanted to show. So let me go like that. So this is a fish not doing very well that is in algae in some kind of pond. Obviously the fish is dead because it's on its side and its eye is all white and gross. Algae does not look like a tree or a grass, but we know it's a plant because, well, frankly, it's green. This is always a tip-off because it's green, so it has chlorophyll. It's a plant. Algae can grow extremely fast. So if you add nutrients to water, the algae can grow really quickly to soak up those nutrients. The problem with that is that with the algae growing so fast, they're able to choke out other plants that might grow a bit more slowly in the water that are better habitat for the fish, better food for the living things in the food chain. But the real problem with algae is that, yes, they do make they do make oxygen for the living things in the ecosystem, but once the algae die, which they do very quickly, and they sink to the bottom, sinking to the bottom, they are then decomposed. The organisms that decompose them are bacteria, and bacteria can decompose algae at very low oxygen concentrations and then at zero oxygen concentrations. They decompose the algae most efficiently using oxygen, but then they can keep doing it when there's no oxygen left. And what this means, it's called anaerobic decomposition. You don't really need to know that yet, but what it does mean for the fish is that the bacteria, when they break down the algae, they take all the oxygen out of the water. So as a result, you get these stagnant ponds full of bacteria that all the fish have died in. An abundance of growth, but the fish died because the oxygen got soaked out of the water by bacteria. So bacteria can be great for nutrient cycles like the nitrogen cycle, but they can also be very bad for living things. What you see happening right here is a process called eutrophication. Here, I'll find it up here. There is the word right there. What that is that's happening is an excessive growth of algae in a plant ecosystem. There is a such thing as there are ponds and there are lakes that are eutrophied that are still good animal habitat, but if it gets too far, again, you run out of the oxygen in the water. And even when you have a lake or a pond that's got eutrophication, yes, it might be good habitat for some fish, but the fish that people like to fish for example, trout or steelhead, they don't do well in high nutrient water. You're only going to find those in the cool, clear, quote-unquote, clean type waters like we find around here in Smithers, and less as you go further south. Eutrophication is very often bad for many fish species, and if there's too much of it and you run out of oxygen in the water, the fish die. Here in Smithers, you might get kind of a too rosy a view of how healthy our aquatic ecosystems are. We might take them for granted. You know, we say we go to Lake Cathlin or Seymour Lake or Tyee Lake, and they seem very clean to us. They probably were a lot cleaner in the past. We see fish. It's easy to catch fish around here. If you go to other ecosystems in more heavily populated parts of the world, the waterways are nowhere near so clean. With more people comes more waste. With more waste comes more nitrogen and phosphorus in the water. Nitrogen and phosphorus combine lead to this eutrophication, which can kill the fish. Let's look at where we are, not locally in Smithers, where things are pretty good, although we could be better. Let's look at where things are globally. You remember this diagram I showed you guys a while ago on lesson 1 of this unit? It talks about the planetary boundaries that are being faced by humanity, broken down into several separate environmental problems. Climate change, novel entities, ozone, the ozone layer depletion, aerosols, ocean acidification, freshwater use, land system change, biodiversity. And it said the big problems are extinction, like loss of species. That's huge. It's happening far faster than it can. But also, in what we don't often think about, at least out in here in Smithers, biogeochemical flows. Mostly when we talk about that, we're talking about the big problems because they're the big nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus. What we see from this diagram here is that we're in trouble globally when it comes to nitrogen phosphorus use. Remember how I showed you that diagram that showed that most of the input of nitrogen into biosphere, and I mean the part that people are using and also nature, not being directly used by people, most of the nitrogen input is now coming from fertilizer. It's not coming from the I'm trying to find that diagram again. Nitrogen cycle. There it is. All right, so let's look at this again. Fertilizer, the Haber-Bosch process, puts 120 teragrams of nitrogen into the soil every year globally. Fixation puts in just 56 or 58, I think it was. Isn't that incredible? Fertilizers are putting in double the nitrogen into the soil as is put in by natural fixation. Even if we say, pretend that all the crops imagine if it was all nature and all the crops were just doing fixation but as wild plants, that 60 plus 58 is still less than the 120 that we're pumping into our biosphere by adding extra nitrogen that otherwise would not be in our ecosystems. This is why we're considered to be at our outer limit of tolerance for nitrogen. We're putting a lot of it into our ecosystems, and that's harmful. Now, is it necessary? I did also say to you earlier on that we could not have as many people in the world as we do today if it weren't for all the fertilizer we use. The fertilizer we use through the crops we eat feeds billions of people. I'm just saying that it comes at a cost. Here, let me show you one other thing. Google. I'm going to look for something that I think I'll find. All right, so this is the Mississippi Delta. I just did a search for New Orleans. I think this is Mississippi Delta. I don't know my geography well enough. Yep, I was right. All right, let's look at what things look like off the coast of Mississippi. All right, something you can, not showing up as much as I expected it to, but you can kind of see it right here, that the Mississippi River, you know what? Forget it. I'm not even going to show this part. It's not showing up not showing up on this diagram the way I thought it was going to. Let's just go to here. Okay. I will talk about the experiment, and then I'll show you, you'll see the videos about the experiment. First of all, the purpose of the experiment is to see if I can cause eutrophication in some water samples I collected from Smithers. And if it works, then that's great. We can do a lab write-up out of it. So this is Google Maps. Here we are in Smithers. This is where I'm at right now. This is where the school is and so forth. All right. Here's where I collected the water. I collected a sample of water from Smithers Secondary, tap water. The tap water in Smithers is great, by the way. It basically is groundwater that comes off the mountain, filtered groundwater, so it's some of the best quality tap water you're going to get anywhere in the world. I also collected some water from the ditch by the highway, as you see in the video. And I also went into the forest here, right after there'd been a really big rainstorm, and I collected some river water. And in the experiment, I'm looking at what can I do by adding nitrogen to the water? How about by adding phosphorus to the water? And what happens if I do both? So that's called a factorial experiment, and we've got those two factors, nitrogen and phosphorus. And we're going to see what happens. At this point in time, I've just started the experiment yesterday, and you know what? It might not work at all. But if it does work, I think you can imagine what your prediction would be once you have a look at what the experimental design is. When you do look at the finished experimental design, I want you to think about and make a prediction about what those beakers might look like if the experiment goes as you might expect it to. That's all from the screen lesson, and I hope that you enjoy my video about the lab activity itself. Hi there, Science 9. So I am here at Chicken Creek on May the 20th, and this is for the nitrogen and phosphorus cycle lab. This has been a big storm. I'm going to collect some water from Chicken Creek. I'm going to use it in this experiment that I'm talking to you about nutrient cycling and looking at plant production. Pretty awesome spot I'm at right now. I'm just going to switch this around and give you an idea. This is the river water from Chicken Creek we'll use for the nutrient cycling experiment. Hi, Science 9. So now I'm close to the highway by the school, and I'm going to take water samples actually from a ditch by the side of the highway. We're going to be able to compare to see what happens when we add fertilizer to the phosphorus and nitrogen to the water samples from the river, comparing that with what happens when we add phosphorus and nitrogen to the samples that are from the stagnant water by the side of the highway. So we're gonna just go over here right now and collect that water, and then we'll go from there. So what they've got here actually is called an artificial or constructed wetland, where they have, as far as I can tell, they've purposefully planted wetland plants here, like they're called cattails or tool rushes. This is something people will often do when they want to improve wildlife habitat, is they'll plant wetland plants in there. So I'm going to put the phone here. Equipment is bucket, scooper. Here's the water sample right here, a little bit murky. You can see a bit of organic matter floating around in there. Now we're going to take this back to the science lab and start the experiment. Hi Science 9, so now I'm going to start the experiment. The purpose of the experiment is to look at nitrogen and phosphorus, those nutrients, what they do in a freshwater ecosystem. So I was thinking about this, what to do, and I decided it would be kind of cool to compare two different water sources, in fact really three, and look to see what would happen if I added what's considered to be a lot of nitrogen and a lot of phosphorus, and separately to these water samples. See how much of a difference can I make with nitrogen, how much of a difference can I make with phosphorus, and what do they do when I add them together. So that's what I'm going to do with the lab supplies I found here. So here's what I've got. First of all, this is sodium phosphate. That's what I'm going to get the phosphorus from. This is ammonium chloride. That's the source of the nitrogen. My water, well, you've seen videos where I collected it. This water here comes from the side of the highway in a ditch. This water here is the stuff you saw me collect when I was by the stream. So it's very different. It's from the same watershed, Chicken Creek, but otherwise it's like really different, right? The stuff that came from the side of the highway, that was off flow from a ditch. So you got traffic going by, but it's also an artificial, like constructed wetland. So they've actually made that ecosystem a little bit better in that way. And as for the water from the stream, that probably was rain. A lot of that was rain that fell the same day because it was washing right off the mountain. And when I was there, the stream was really high, full of silty water, so pushing a lot of water off the mountain. And then I figured, well, let's see what happens about, let's look at fresh water. So the other water I'm using for this lab, I got it straight out of the tap. Probably a lot of you already know that the water we get out of the tap here in Smithers is really, really clean. If you ever move to the city, you're going to be noticing there's a bit of a taste to the water there. In Vancouver, for example, they're adding chlorine to the water, and you can taste that when you arrive in the city in comparison with here, where the water is so pure that we get off the mountain, we don't have to do any of that stuff with it. So the amounts of the nutrients that I'm adding are actually really small, and what I'm doing right now is I'm going by the best sources I've got to tell me how much I need to make this response happen. What I'm wondering will happen, whether it's going to happen or not, is if algae will grow, right? That's how you know when you've added a lot of nutrients to the water and you see like a green slime growing either at the bottom or on things that are dipped into the water, then you know there's too much nutrients there, and that's not really a good thing, at least for a lot of things, like not very good for fish, for example. How much is too much? The sources I've looked at say as soon as your water is above 1 milligram per liter of nitrogen and of phosphorus, I think it's especially said phosphorus, then you've got a problem. You know, I was able to find it for phosphorus, but I looked so hard I couldn't find a single value for nitrogen that said this is the bad value to have. So I just figured let's keep it simple, have the nitrogen and the phosphorus values equal to each other. So in both cases, it's 1 milligram per liter. Now to do this, I'm making stock solutions, and I'm using a scale that actually is not really very sensitive. That only goes down to the 1/100th of a gram. It doesn't even measure down to the milligram, but that is fine because I can just add less to the as I go. It all works out. Here's what I've got. I'm gonna have to pause the video now actually because I'm running out of space. All right, I'm back. So here's what I've done. I've measured out my amounts of phosphorus. This is this from the sodium phosphate. This is going to give us 1 milligram per liter of the phosphorus itself. And this is for the nitrogen. See, really just a very small amount. I measured it in these little beakers here. So now I'm going to add this phosphorus to the water here. And this is going to be the stock solution for the phosphorus. It's where I'm going to get my phosphorus from. So just dissolving that. The sodium phosphate's pretty soluble stuff, so that's going to dissolve in there really easily. Now I'm just going to dissolve my nitrogen, my ammonium chloride here directly into this water here. This is going to give us about 1 milligram per liter of nitrogen, 1 milligram per liter of phosphorus. So there's going to be, for each type of water, we're going to have 4 different possible treatments. One is going to be no nutrients. Another is going to be only nitrogen. Another is going to be only phosphorus. And the fourth one will be both of them. I've already added all the water samples to these. So now it's just a matter of pouring in the fertilizer. I have this beaker right here, or excuse me, cylinder right here, and I'll measure that out. Okay, and I've done every one of these but one. So I'm going to show you what it looked like for me to do one of them. Here's where we're at so far. I have 12 beakers. Each of these is 250 milliliter beakers, by the way. As I've done each one of these, I have put what's called an spot glass over top of it, so it's sealed and we know it's done. So in each of the beakers, there is a sample of the stream water or of tap water or ditch water, depending. And each beaker has one of 4 different treatments, either no nutrients or nitrogen added, or phosphorus, or both of those 2 added. So maybe this would be a good time for you to think which of the 3, ditch water, tap water, or stream water, is going to grow the most algae, which will grow the least. Or do you think 1 milligram per liter of anything is not enough to make algae grow? We're going to see what happens. So at this point then, I've added all the phosphates, all the phosphorus, and I've added all but one of the nitrogens. So I'm just going to show you what that looks like. It's very simple. Funnel, graduated cylinder on top. I'm going to pour until I have about 20 milliliters of the nitrogen. This is nitrogen. There we go. And that is the stuff I'm going to put into the ditch water. This ditch water has already received phosphate, so that makes this the nitrogen and phosphorus treatment. Pour it in. And I just put a spot glass on that as well. Spot glasses are useful because naturally with it sitting in the window, it's probably going to start to lose a bit of water and dry out a little bit. We don't want that to happen immediately. Of course, as everything is in glass, and I'm putting it by the window. Why do you think? Because algae are tiny plants. Being tiny plants, they need water. Oh, that's no problem. They're in water, but they need light as well. So I'm going to put them by the sunlight by the window. And if the experiment works, hopefully it does work, then we'll be able to talk about the nitrogen and the phosphorus cycle.